Welcome everyone to today's video. Based on some things that have been coming up for me in my practice over the last, I might say, months, I thought it might be useful to share some insight in relation to the topic of whether our practice is one that evolves in a linear manner over time. That is to say that we make progress in a linear fashion as we practice day to day. When we take on any kind of practice or we commit to doing anything on a regular basis, given our conditioning and given the culture in which we live, it's quite reasonable that we end up having some expectations around where that practice should take us. It's quite reasonable that we might even set some goals around where we might expect to see ourselves within a given space of time due to committing to that practice or due to committing to that endeavor. Now, in many ways, on a superficial level, and I don't mean that in any way in a derogatory sense, but just on the surface, that kind of makes sense. But the reality is that yoga deals with the holistic nature of our being. And it also deals with the fact that in any given moment, we are only aware of the things that we are aware of. So the known knowns, you might say, the things that we know perhaps that we want to work on, which to start with might be flexibility in the body, or it might be strength in the body, or it might be calming the mind. Now, in my own experience, some years ago when I started practicing, I observed and noticed and felt a huge release of tension quite quickly or early on in my practice when I started committing to a daily practice. And really what happened then for a long time is I spent a number of years, we might say, in a state of feeling generally quite peaceful and quite relaxed. Now, the reality of what was going on there was that I was in a state before that was full of so much tension, so much what we might call emotional disturbance, that actually any shift into a slightly calmer space was going to feel very significant. And that was great because then for a long time I was able to work on my practices and I was able to feel a huge difference to the way that I'd spent the previous 20 odd years of my life. Now, the reality is also that what came with that, if I'm honest with myself and if I'm honest with you, which I'm going to be, in a lot of ways, I kind of thought, oh, I'm done now. I'm kind of at peace and everything seems to be flowing so easily in my life and there seems to be no tension and all the circumstances that are prevailing are ones that seem to be encouraging me towards more peace and so on. But then what I began to realize is a couple of things, and of course this is only possible with insight and with hindsight, one might say, which is that actually what had happened was, yes, I had resolved some superficial issues, which have meant that I was feeling a lot calmer. But also, as I said, the prevailing circumstances in my life at that time, for whatever reason, weren't triggering some of the other issues and some of the stuff that was more deeply stored in that particular moment of time, which gives the impression that perhaps we have overcome some of those patterns or some of those tendencies. My life really began to change when, first of all, we had our daughter, who is now 2.5. Secondly, we moved country. And third of all, our kind of situation and circumstances completely changed, which meant that the way in which we've been living, the way in which I've been living, needed to be updated. It needed to evolve. And so therefore, what I found over the last couple of years actually is starting to get triggered again on some of those deeper levels, feelings of fear, feelings of anxiety that come up, feelings of tension, which I began to realize were actually simmering at a much lower level, which in some ways the peace that I had been feeling, whilst genuine, had been kind of disguising the fact that there was what I often call a deeper layer of the onion. If we think of ourselves like onions, and the work of our practice is gradually to come to know a layer of the onion, and then slowly to see if we can dissolve that layer of the onion, feel the benefits from that, but then fortunately or unfortunately, we then realize, there's another layer of the onion, and then we come to know that. We notice what it does to us in terms of our lives and whether we suffer from it, what it causes us to do, the patterns that are locked in around that layer, and gradually we work into that layer through various practices. And so what I'm finding at the moment is that actually I'm now in a stage of my life where there are many, many more triggers which are making me aware of the fact that there is still a long, long way to go in terms of the evolution of my practice and the evolution of my ability to sit comfortably with what I am and allow things to release as they need to release. Now, if we relate this back to the topic of the idea of what does it mean by linear progress, if I was to look at this through a particular lens, I might actually say, well, you know what, I've been practicing for a certain number of years now. The first few years I felt really, really peaceful, and now the last few years I've actually felt much less peaceful. Still not as disturbed as I was in the first place before practice, but definitely not in the same kind of frame or peaceful state that I was for a number of years until quite recently. I might say, actually, well, my practice has actually taken a step back, and actually, in some way, I'm actually not making progress anymore. But the reality couldn't be further from the truth, and this is why I often say that progress in yoga is not linear in the way that we might perceive it. In the same way that when you see a tall building where they're breaking ground for the first time to build that building, it takes them many, many months or longer to dig down in order to create the foundations. And it's only when the foundations have been built and are solid and stable that then the rest of the building arises. And so I think in relation to our practice, we can relate to this metaphor in the sense that there will be a lot of times where we are building the foundations and it appears that there is no tangible progress in inverted commas. But then quite out of the blue, and of course it's not out of the blue, suddenly we start to see that we're making progress again in certain specific ways. So this is a reminder that actually the way in which we might perceive progress is not actually necessarily the way in which our practice and our evolution is going to take place. So for me right now, my practice is actually sitting with the difficulties, being aware of them, but using the resilience and the power of awareness that I've practiced over the last few years to be able to sit with those things in a way that previously I just wasn't able to do. Therefore, I'm bringing, we might say, the fruit of my practice thus far in order to meet, greet, understand, and be with the new circumstances that I find arising within myself, and to meet the deeper or the more deeply entrenched patterns which I'm finding inside myself. So perhaps we can all relate to this in different ways. Those of us that have regular practice, those of us that come to practice from time to time, we might often judge ourselves and question whether we are making progress. And the reality of the situation is this, is that we really don't know what progress means in the fullest sense. We often don't know what we truly need in order to actually advance. And sometimes there are seasons where it feels like things are very, very still, almost as though they are sliding backwards. But we often need those seasons in order to build the ground so that we can evolve into the next progression or the next stage of our evolution or of our growth. And that is why fundamentally, as referenced in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, while referenced by many, many great teachers, is that all of the time when we're practicing and when we're not, meaning off the mat, for example, we need to cultivate faith. We need to have a deeply felt sense that what we are doing over the long term is beneficial, even if day to day or even month to month or season to season, it may not appear to be so when we analyze it from that superficial level. Having the faith that something has brought us to this path, something is fueling our commitment to move forward with these practices, and just taking heart in the fact that if we show up every day to practice in whatever form that takes for you, over time, we are going to move deeper and deeper into connection with ourselves, as hard as that may be at times. And ultimately, over time, this is going to bring us a deeper understanding of who we are. It is going to help to develop a better and more healthy relationship with our minds, with our bodies, with our emotions. And then, of course, more externally, will help us to develop a more peaceful, calm, compassionate, understanding relationship with all those people around us and all the circumstances that we find in our lives, which at times can be so, so challenging. Because let's face it, life is challenging. And that is the beauty of yoga. It teaches us how to evolve from those challenges, how to learn from those challenges, how to grow from those challenges, as long as we're prepared to make that commitment over the long term. So I just wanted to share that briefly because I think all of us experience moments where we feel despondent about our practice, despondent about whether we're getting anywhere. And I just wanted to say from recent experience through my own practice, for whatever that counts for, that actually what I'm beginning to see is that there is no stage of our practice that isn't useful in some way in fueling our evolution. We may just not understand what it is in that moment of time. So please do reflect on this. Please do bring this into your own perception and thinking about your own practice and allow it to help to stoke faith in your practice, to develop your practice over the long term and to keep that commitment unshakably solid. As always, many thanks for joining. I hope that you are finding these videos useful and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Namaste.